In the unforgiving heart of the Montana frontier, some scars are carved into the land, others into the soul. For Colton Blackwood, the master of the sprawling Blackwood Dominion, they were one and the same. A man so horrifically burned that children fled from his shadow and whispers followed him like a curse. He was the richest man for 100 miles, yet the poorest in human connection. Nobody wanted his hand, his name, or his fortune if it meant enduring the sight of him. Until Annalise Callahan. A woman left with nothing but her grit, she made a bargain with the beast, only to discover that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones with visible scars, but the ones who hide their darkness behind a handsome smile. This is the story of a love that refused to be blind and a truth that had to be burned into the light. The dust of Whispering Creek, Montana, tasted of failed promises. Annalise, Annie Callahan, felt it coat her tongue, a gritty finality to a journey that had begun with the rustle of hopeful letters and ended in the stark silence of abandonment. She stood on the splintered boardwalk, her packed trunk beside her, feeling more like a coffin for her dreams than a vessel of her worldly possessions. The man she had crossed a continent to marry a Mr. Percival Fletcher did not exist. Or rather, he had existed just long enough to correspond with a lonely woman in Boston, secure her passage west, and then vanish, leaving behind nothing but a string of debts and the snickering pity of the townsfolk. Whispering Creek was a town that lived up to its name. The whispers followed her from the general store, where she learned the truth of her situation, to the boarding house where the proprietor, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. No respectable woman comes out here alone without family or a husband waiting, she had declared, her voice loud enough for the other tenants to hear. Annie's cheeks burned, but she held her chin high, a lifetime of quiet resilience stealing her spine. She was stranded. Her return fare had been spent on essentials for her new life, a life that had evaporated like a mirage. For 2 days she sought work. She could cook, clean, sew, and teach, but in Whispering Creek, every door was closed to the jilted mail-order bride. She was a curiosity, a cautionary tale, and a burden the town was unwilling to shoulder. The men looked at her with a speculative hunger she found unnerving, while the women looked at her as if she were a fallen dove, her white feathers irrevocably soiled. It was on her 3rd day, as the last of her money dwindled to a few pitiful coins, that she first heard his name spoken in the hushed, fearful tones reserved for legends and devils. She was nursing a weak cup of coffee in the town's only eatery when a group of ranch hands came in their spurs, jingling a raucous rhythm on the floorboards. "Saw Blackwood's wagon heading for the ridge," one of them said, his voice dropping. "Gave it a wide berth. I swear, just the sight of that man can curdle milk. My boy Tommy saw him up close last month," another added, leaning in conspiratorially. "Came home screaming. Nightmares for a week. Said his face looked like a melted candle." The name hung in the air. Colton Blackwood, the beast of Blackwood Ridge, the scarred millionaire. The whispers painted a portrait of a monster, a man hideously disfigured in a fire years ago that had claimed his entire family. He had inherited the most prosperous ranch in the territory, the Blackwood Dominion, but lived as a recluse, a phantom who rarely showed his ruined face. They said he was mad that the fire had not only taken his skin, but his sanity. Annie tried to dismiss it as cruel gossip, the kind that festers in small, isolated places. But later that afternoon, she saw for herself. A large black wagon, pulled by two magnificent black stallions, rumbled down the main street. It was a vehicle of stark and imposing wealth, its polished wood gleaming even under a coat of dust. At the reins sat a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. He was a large man, dressed in dark, well-made clothes. But it was his face, or what was left of it, that silenced the street. The right side of his face was a tapestry of horrors. The skin was a melted, waxy landscape of scar tissue, pulling his eye into a permanent, unnerving squint, and twisting his mouth into a grotesque sneer. The fire had stolen his ear on that side, leaving a puckered hollow. A wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow, but it could not hide the ruin beneath. People scurried away. Mothers pulled their children close. The jovial noise of the street evaporated, replaced by a tense, fearful silence. He did not look at them. His gaze from the one eye that seemed normal, a startlingly intense shade of blue, was fixed straight ahead. He pulled the wagon to a stop before the mercantile. For a long moment, he just sat there, as if gathering the courage to dismount into the sea of hostile stares. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he swung himself down. He moved with a strange, stiff grace, a man at odds with his own body. Annie stood frozen across the street, unable to look away. She saw not just the scars, but the immense, crushing weight of the town's revulsion. She saw the set of his shoulders, braced for an impact no one could see. He disappeared into the store, and the town exhaled the whispers, starting up again, more frantic this time. She felt a strange pang in her chest. It was not pity, not exactly. It was a flicker of recognition. She too knew what it was like to be judged on sight, to be branded and cast aside. Her scars were invisible, the shame of being duped, the loneliness of being utterly alone. But they were there, raw and aching. That night her situation became truly desperate. Mrs. Gable informed her that her room would be given to a paying customer by morning. "I'm not running a charity, Miss Callahan," she'd said, her arms crossed a final unyielding wall. As Annie sat on her bed, the town's whispers echoed in her mind, mingling with the fears for her own future. She thought of the speculative gleam in the eyes of the men in the saloon. She thought of the endless empty plains and the coming winter. Then an idea so audacious, so utterly mad began to form in her mind. It was a spark of desperation, fanned by the image of the man with the ruined face and the proud straight back. The town saw him as a monster, but they also called him rich, a man that isolated that wealthy must have needs. Perhaps, she thought with a shiver of fear and resolve, he needed something only she was desperate enough to offer. The next morning found Annie walking on the edge of town, her small valise in hand, the trunk left behind as collateral she knew she could never reclaim. The sun was a merciless eye in the vast blue sky, mocking her destitution. Her path led her past the office of the land registrar, and it was there that her bleak day took a turn for the worse. A man stepped out, tall and impeccably dressed. He had sandy hair, a charming, easy smile, and the predatory eyes of a wolf. Annie recognized him from the saloon. He was the one whose gaze had lingered the longest. "Miss Callahan," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was smooth as polished river stone. "A pleasure to see you again. I am Beauregard Sinclair. My friends call me Beau." "Mr. Sinclair," Annie replied coolly, her grip tightening on her bag. "I heard of your unfortunate situation." He continued, his smile never faltering. A lady of your quality and beauty should not be so distressed. Whispering Creek can be a harsh place for those without a protector. His words were honey-laced, but the implication was vinegar. He was the owner of the second largest ranch in the valley, a rival to the Blackwood Dominion. He was a man of power and influence, and he was offering her a lifeline. Annie knew with chilling certainty what kind of lifeline it would be. I am in need of a housekeeper at my ranch. Bo went on, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her feel undressed. The work would be light. You would be well cared for. All you would need to do is be accommodating. The final word was a silken trap. He was offering her protection in exchange for her virtue, a gilded core where she would be his possession. The thought turned her stomach. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Sinclair, she said, her voice tight. But I am not interested in being accommodating. Bo's smile tightened, the charm receding, to reveal the cold steel beneath. A pity, he said. Out here, pride is a luxury few can afford. You'll find there are far worse fates than my generosity. He tipped his hat again and walked away, leaving her with a renewed sense of dread. His offer, as odious as it was, highlighted the grim reality of her options. It was then, with Bo Sinclair's veiled threat echoing in her ears, that she made her choice. She would trade one gilded cage for another, but on her own terms. She turned her back on the town and began the long, dusty walk towards the Blackwood Ridge. The journey took hours. The road climbed steadily, the sparse grasslands giving way to pine-forested hills. The air grew cooler, cleaner. As she rounded a bend, the Blackwood Dominion spread out before her, and she gasped. It was not the dark, menacing fortress she had imagined. It was a breathtaking valley, a lush green jewel cradled by rugged peaks. A river snaked through it, glittering in the sun. Herds of fine-looking cattle grazed peacefully, and in the center of it all, nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees, was the house. It was a magnificent two-story ranch house built of dark timber and stone, with wide verandas and glass windows that flashed in the sunlight. It was a home built with wealth and taste, yet there was an unnerving stillness about it. No children played in the yard. No ranch hands ambled about. It was a silent kingdom, ruled by a silent king. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the front door. It was massive, carved from a single piece of oak. Taking a deep breath, she raised her hand and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the immense silence. She waited, her courage faltering. She was about to turn away when the door creaked open. A woman stood there, gaunt and severe, her hair pulled into a tight grey bun. She wore a simple black dress and an expression of permanent disapproval. This must be Martha, the housekeeper. The town had whispered about Colton Blackwood's keeper. "What do you want?" the woman asked, her voice as brittle as dry leaves. I am here to see Mr. Blackwood," Annie managed to say. Martha's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Blackwood does not receive visitors." "Please," Annie insisted, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "It is a matter of great importance, a business proposition." The housekeeper looked her up and down, taking in her dusty dress and wind-blown hair. A flicker of something, perhaps curiosity, crossed her etern features. "Wait here," she commanded, and shut the door in Annie's face. Annie waited for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing in on her. She was on the verge of fleeing when the door opened again. "He will see you," Martha said, her tone begrudging. "Follow me." She was led into a study that smelled of leather wood smoke and old paper. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within it, despite the warmth of the day. And there, standing by the window with his back to her, was Colton Blackwood. He was even larger than he had seemed in the wagon. His shoulders were broad, filling out his fine wool coat. He did not turn. "State your business," he said. His voice was a low, rough baritone, like rocks grinding together. It was a voice unused to conversation, and it held a deep, resonating sadness. Annie's carefully rehearsed speech deserted her. Her throat went dry. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Annalise Callahan. I am in a difficult position." He remained silent, his back a formidable wall. Taking a shaky breath, she forced the words out. "I am given to understand that you are a man of means, but one who values his privacy. The townspeople, they are unkind." Still he did not move. "I am a woman without prospects, Mr. Blackwood. I have no family, no money, and no home. What I have is a respectable name and a good education. What you have is a grand house and a fortune, but you lack a wife, a hostess, a shield against the prying eyes of the world." The air in the room grew thick with tension. She had laid her cards on the table, her audacity shocking even herself. "I am proposing a marriage, Mr. Blackwood," she said, the words rushing out in a torrent. "A marriage of convenience, a partnership. I would be your wife in name only. I would manage this household, create an air of domestic respectability for you. In return, I ask for your protection and the security of your name. I will not make any demands on you. I will not pry into your affairs. I will simply be a presence in your home, a buffer between you and the world that has been so cruel. I will not recoil from your injuries." At this, he finally moved. He turned slowly, deliberately to face her. Annie braced herself, but the sight of him up close was still a shock. The scars were a brutal geography of pain. The fire had been a merciless artist. But as she forced herself to hold his gaze, to look past the disfigurement, she saw his eyes. The one undamaged eye was a piercing, intelligent blue. The other, pulled taut by the scar tissue, wept a single, constant tear that traced a path through the ruined landscape of his cheek. And in those eyes she saw not madness, but a profound, bottomless well of loneliness and pain. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, his expression unreadable. She saw a flicker of surprise, of disbelief, and then something else. Something she couldn't name. "Why?" He rasped the single word, scraping his throat. "Why would you shackle yourself to a man like me?" "Because," Annie answered, her voice finding its strength, "I believe that some cages are safer than others, and because I suspect your scars are no uglier than the secrets Mr. Beau Sinclair keeps behind his handsome face." A look of shock crossed his features at the mention of Sinclair's name. For the first time, a spark of life, of sharp, dangerous intelligence lit his eyes. He studied her not as a woman, but as a puzzle, a strange, unexpected move in a game he had long since forfeited. "You have courage, Miss Callahan," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Or you are a fool." "Perhaps I am a bit of both, Mr. Blackwood," she replied. "The question is, do you have a need for either?" He turned back to the window, looking out at his vast, empty kingdom. The silence stretched thick with the weight of his decision. Annie's heart pounded. This was it. Rejection here would mean the end of the line. There would be conditions, he said at last, his back still to her. Strict conditions. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her. I would expect nothing less. You would have your own rooms. You would not enter my wing of the house. Ever. Our interactions will be minimal. Martha manages the staff. You will manage the appearance of things. To the outside world, we are man and wife. Within these walls, we are strangers. Agreed, Annie said without hesitation. Very well, Miss Callahan, Colton Blackwood said, turning to face her once more. His one good eye bored into her, searching for any sign of deceit or revulsion. It seems you have yourself a husband. The wedding was a swift, sterile affair, conducted by a travelling justice of the peace who was paid handsomely to ask no questions and to forget the faces of the groom and bride. Martha and a taciturn ranch hand named Finn were the only witnesses. Annie wore her best dress, a simple blue muslin, and stood beside a man she did not know, whose scarred face was partially shadowed by his hat. Colton Blackwood did not touch her. His vows were spoken in that same low, gravelly voice, the words delivered to a point somewhere over her shoulder. When it was over, there was no celebration, no kind words. There was only the rustle of paperwork and the clink of coin as the justice was paid and hurried on his way. Annie was now Mrs. Blackwood, the mistress of a silent mansion and the wife of a ghost. Life in the Blackwood Dominion was a study in contrasts. Outside the ranch was a vibrant, thriving enterprise. Hundreds of cattle roamed the lush pastures, tended by a small, efficient crew of hands who lived in a bunkhouse a mile from the main house and who seemed to have mastered the art of being invisible. The foreman, Finn, a quiet man with kind eyes, would deliver a weekly report to Martha, who would then relay it to Colton. The entire operation ran with a precision that spoke of a keen, controlling mind. Inside the house, however, a suffocating silence reigned. The rooms were vast and beautifully appointed, with heavy, dark furniture, rich carpets, and fine art that seemed incongruous in the wilds of Montana. But it was a museum, not a home. There was no laughter, no music, no clutter of daily life. The air was heavy with unspoken sorrows. Annie was given a suite of rooms in the East Wing, as far from Colton's private chambers in the West Wing as possible. Her rooms were luxurious, with a canopied bed, a private sitting area, and windows that looked out over a walled garden that had long ago gone to seed. It was a comfortable prison, a gilded cage. Her days fell into a strange, lonely rhythm. She was a queen with no subjects and no purpose. Martha ran the household with an iron fist, overseeing the two timid maids who cleaned the cavernous rooms. The cook, a plump, perpetually flustered woman named Mary, produced meals that were placed on a sideboard in the grand dining room. Annie ate alone. Colton, she soon learned, took all his meals in his study. She saw him only in fleeting glimpses, a broad-shouldered silhouette in a distant window, the sound of his heavy, uneven footsteps in the hall late at night. He was a constant, haunting presence, yet he was never there at all. Her role, the one she had proposed, was a phantom one. There were no social calls to make, no dinners to host. The name Blackwood kept the world at bay far more effectively than any hostess ever could. The townspeople of Whispering Creek spoke of the mad marriage in scandalized tones. The scarred beast had bought himself a pretty wife. They pitied her, scorned her, and speculated endlessly about what horrors she must endure. Their gossip was a wall that isolated the ranch completely. Loneliness began to gnaw at Annie. She had traded one form of isolation for another. In her desperation to escape the town's judgment, she had locked herself away with it. She spent her hours reading from the immense library, her only real solace. It was there she began to find the first clues to the man she had married. The collection was astounding. There were leather-bound classics volumes of poetry, complex texts on architecture, engineering, and animal husbandry. This was not the library of a mad, uneducated brute. It was the library of a brilliant, curious mind. On some of the pages she found faint pencil notations in a strong, clear hand, insightful observations that made her pause. She felt as though she were having a conversation with a man who refused to speak to her. One afternoon, driven by a need for air and purpose, she ventured into the overgrown walled garden behind her rooms. Weeds choked what had once been elegant flower beds. A stone bird bath was cracked and dry. It was a place of forgotten beauty. Armed with a pair of rusty shears and gloves from the potting shed, she set to work. She pulled weeds, trimmed back the thorny, grasping branches of old roses, and cleared the debris. It was hard physical work, and it soothed a part of her soul that the silent house could not reach. She worked there for days, losing herself in the rhythm of restoration. One evening as dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft pink, she looked up at the house. And she saw him. Colton was standing in the window of his study in the west wing watching her. He was just a silhouette against the lamplight, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. She froze, her heart fluttering. She expected him to pull away, to retreat back into the shadows, as he always did. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching. For the first time, Annie didn't feel like an intruder or a stranger. She felt seen. The next morning, when she went out to the garden, she found a set of new high-quality gardening tools lying by the gate, along with several sacks of rich topsoil. There was no note, no explanation. There didn't need to be. It was a small gesture, but it was a crack in the wall of silence between them. A few days later, a second crack appeared. A severe autumn storm blew in, rattling the windows and moaning around the eaves of the house. Annie was in the library trying to lose herself in a novel when a sudden, violent gust of wind forced open a window high up on the wall, sending a cascade of rain into the room. The latch was broken, and the window was too high for her to reach, as she was dragging a heavy chair over to climb on the library doors opened. Colton stood there. It was the first time they had been in the same room since their wedding day. He was dressed simply in a dark shirt and trousers, and without his hat and coat, the full, brutal extent of his scars was visible in the lamplight. Annie's breath caught, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to look away. He didn't speak. He simply walked past her, his limp more pronounced on the polished floor. He reached up his left arm, the one on his unscarred side, easily pushing the window shut. With his other hand, he produced a small tool from his pocket, and with a few deft movements, repaired the broken latch. "Thank you," Annie said, her voice quiet in the cavernous room. He grunted in response, his back to her. He started to leave, but then he paused at the door. He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see his one good eye. "The garden," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It looks better." And then he was gone, leaving Annie standing in the middle of the room, her heart pounding. It was the first direct, personal thing he had ever said to her. He had noticed her work. He had noticed her. The gilded cage suddenly felt a little less cold, a little less empty. She was beginning to suspect that the prisoner she shared it with was not a monster, but a man trapped in a deeper, more painful prison than her own. Colton's brief words about the garden became a seed of courage in Annie's heart. The wall of silence between them had been breached, however minutely, and she found herself growing bolder, more observant. She began to see the man, not just the myth. She noticed how the ranch hands, though they kept their distance, spoke of him with a fierce protective loyalty. She saw the way his scarred hand, though clumsy, could be incredibly gentle when he checked a sick calf Finn had brought near the main house for observation. He was a man of profound contradictions, and Annie's curiosity became a driving force, a mission to understand the truth of his past. Her investigation began in the library. If books were his only companions, perhaps they held his secrets. She started looking for anything related to the year of the fire. Tucked away on a high shelf covered in a thick layer of dust, she found a collection of local newspapers from that time. She spent days poring over them, the dry, yellowed paper crackling under her touch. The official account of the fire that had killed Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood and their young daughter Lily was straightforward. A lantern knocked over in the barn during a winter storm had sparked a blaze that quickly consumed the old wooden structure and spread to the house. A 14-year-old Colton, they reported, had been pulled from the flames, the lone tragic survivor. The story was a neat, tidy tragedy. But as Annie read on, she found inconsistencies. A small article buried deep in one of the papers a week after the fire mentioned that the ranch foreman at the time, a man named Henderson, had left town abruptly just days after the incident. It was a minor detail easily overlooked. Then she found an editorial praising the swift and generous support offered to the orphaned Colton by his neighbor, a much younger Beauregard Sinclair, who had apparently been the first on the scene, leading the bucket brigade. The article painted Beau as a hero, a pillar of the community even then. The mention of Beau Sinclair sent a chill down Annie's spine. His false kindness to her, his predatory nature, made her question his heroic role in the tragedy. It seemed too convenient. Her search for answers led her to Martha. The stern housekeeper was Colton's fortress, his first line of defense against the world. Winning her trust would not be easy. Annie began by simply being present, by helping with small chores, without being asked, by treating the older woman not as a servant, but as the chatelaine of the house she truly was. She would bring Martha a cup of tea in the afternoons, asking quiet questions about the running of the ranch, never about Colton directly. One evening as they sat in the large kitchen, the only truly warm and lived-in room in the house, Annie decided to take a risk. "Martha," she began softly, "the library is such a wonder. Mr. Blackwood's parents must have been great readers." Martha, who was kneading dough with fierce precision, didn't look up. They were. His mother Eleanor taught him to read before he could walk properly. "The fire," Annie said, her voice barely a whisper. "It must have been unspeakable." Martha's hands stilled. She looked at Annie, her dark eyes sharp and penetrating, as if searching for the ghoulish curiosity of the townsfolk. But she saw something else in Annie's expression, genuine empathy. "Unspeakable doesn't begin to cover it," Martha said, her voice losing its brittle edge and taking on a tone of deep old grief. "I was here. I was a young woman, then working for his mother. I was in town buying supplies when the storm hit. By the time I got back..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "The glow in the sky. I'll never forget it." "The papers said it was an accident," Annie prodded gently. Martha snorted a harsh, bitter sound. She resumed her kneading with renewed vigor. "The papers say what men like Beau Sinclair want them to say. He was all over the place playing the hero. But things didn't add up. The foreman Henderson, he was a drunk and a gambler, always in debt to the wrong people. He disappeared right after. And Sinclair, He'd been trying to buy the northern pasture from Thomas Blackwood for months. Thomas wouldn't sell. Said the water rights on that land were the future of the ranch. The pieces began to click into place in Annie's mind. It was a dark and terrible puzzle. After the fire, Martha continued, her voice low and laced with anger. Sinclair was appointed Colton's guardian. For a year, he had control of this place. He tried to get the boy to sign papers to sell him that pasture. Said it would be for the best to lessen his burden. But that boy, even then, he had a spine of steel, scarred and half-mad with grief, but he wouldn't break. He refused. As soon as he turned 15 and was old enough to petition the court, he took back control. Sinclair has hated him for it ever since. He started the whispers then about Colton being touched by the fire, about him being unstable. He made sure the boy became an outcast. The revelation left Annie breathless. Beau Sinclair wasn't just a rival. He was a vulture who had been circling for years, waiting for his moment. His animosity towards Colton wasn't just about land. It was rooted in a thwarted crime. Her conviction that Beau was somehow responsible solidified, but she had no proof, only the word of a grieving housekeeper and her own intuition. Meanwhile, Beau himself was not idle. News of Annie's work in the garden of the small signs of life returning to the Blackwood Ranch had reached town. It threatened the narrative he had so carefully crafted. He began to subtly poison the well. When Finn went to town for supplies, he was met with sly questions. "How's the happy couple? Heard she's just a prisoner up there." "You keep an eye on her, Finn. A man like Blackwood, who knows what he's capable of." Beau spoke to the banker, raising concerns about Colton's erratic behavior, suggesting that a man who would buy a wife might not be fit to manage such a vast estate. He was laying the groundwork, building a case against Colton brick by brick, using the town's fear and prejudice as his mortar. He wanted to isolate them completely, to make the world believe that Colton was a monster, and Annie his unfortunate captive. This way, when he made his move to seize control of the ranch, the public would see it not as theft, but as a rescue. Annie realized they weren't just in a gilded cage. They were in a besieged castle, and the enemy was gathering at the gates. The first snows of winter came early that year, dusting the peaks in white and serving as a harbinger of the brutal cold to come. The tension on the ranch was palpable. Beau Sinclair's campaign of whispers had intensified, and the sense of isolation around the Blackwood Dominion felt more profound than ever. Annie felt like she was holding her breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The crisis, when it came, was not from Beau, but from nature itself. A blizzard descended from the north with shocking ferocity, a churning wall of white that swallowed the landscape whole. It began in the late afternoon, and within an hour, the world outside the windows was an indistinct, roaring fury. Finn, the foreman, had taken 2 hands to check on a herd in the high pastures that morning. They should have been back hours ago. As darkness fell, and the wind shrieked like a banshee, a knot of fear tightened in Annie's stomach. Martha stood by the kitchen window, her face a grim mask peering into the maelstrom. "They're not back," she stated, the words clipped. In that moment, the west wing door to the kitchen flew open. Colton stood there, already pulling on a heavy sheepskin-lined coat. The lamplight fell on his scarred face, and for the first time Annie saw not a recluse, but a commander. The haunted look in his eye was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. "They would have taken shelter in the old north cabin," he said, his voice a low command, not to anyone in particular, but to the storm itself. But the roof is weak, and they won't have enough food for more than a day. You can't go out in this, Martha cried, her composure finally breaking. It's suicide, and leaving them out there is murder, he shot back. He strode towards the back door. I'm coming with you, Annie said, surprising herself as much as him. Colton stopped and turned his one good eye, fixing her with a look of disbelief. Don't be ridiculous. This is not a game. I'm not being ridiculous, she countered, her chin set with determination. You'll need help. What if one of them is injured? I know how to bind a wound and set a bone. My father was a doctor. You'll be focused on getting there. You'll need someone to tend to the men. He stared at her, a silent battle of wills passing between them. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a steady, unwavering resolve. It was the same look she'd had the day she proposed their bargain. He gave a curt, reluctant nod. Get the warmest clothes you have, and the medical bag from the top shelf of the pantry. Martha, pack food and coffee. Enough for 5. His orders were swift and precise. The house, usually so silent, sprang into a flurry of controlled activity. Annie dressed in layers of wool, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange, exhilarating sense of purpose. When she returned to the kitchen, Colton was waiting, a lantern in his hand. He looked at her, bundled up and ready, and a flicker of an unreadable emotion crossed his face. The journey to the stables was a brutal fight against the wind and blinding snow. Colton moved with a surprising certainty, one hand gripping Annie's arm to keep her from being blown off her feet. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet she felt a current of strength from it. In the stable he saddled 2 of the strongest horses, his movements economical and sure. Riding into the blizzard was like entering a different world. The snow was a physical force, stinging their faces and stealing their breath. Annie could see nothing but the faint glow of Colton's lantern a few feet ahead of her, and the broad shape of his back. She trusted him completely, following his lead as he navigated the treacherous snow-covered terrain from memory. It took them nearly 3 hours to travel a distance that would normally take less than 1. They found the cabin half buried in a snowdrift, its roof sagging dangerously. Inside they found Finn and the 2 other men, cold and hungry, but alive. One of them, a young man named Billy, had a badly sprained ankle from a fall. The relief in Finn's eyes when he saw Colton was profound. Boss, we weren't sure anyone could get through. Worry about that later, Colton grunted, already unpacking the supplies. As Colton and Finn worked to secure the damaged roof and care for the horses, Annie took charge of the injured man. She gently examined Billy's ankle, her touch confident and practiced. She wrapped it tightly, her movements efficient. She dispensed the hot coffee and food, her calm demeanor, a reassuring presence in the small, cramped cabin. Colton watched her from the corner of the room. He watched as she spoke softly to Billy, easing his fears. He saw the way Finn and the other man looked at her with a newfound respect. He saw not a fragile Boston lady, but a woman of immense strength and compassion. She belonged here in this harsh and unforgiving land more than she ever could have in a city parlor. They were forced to wait out the worst of the storm in the cabin. The 5 of them were huddled together, the wind howling outside. The rigid barriers of the Blackwood mansion dissolved in the shared crisis. The men, once so intimidated by their boss, spoke to him of their concerns about the herd. And Colton, to Annie's astonishment, listened. He spoke back, his voice still rough, but the words were those of a knowledgeable and deeply committed rancher. He wasn't just a rich man. He had built this empire with his own 2 hands and a sharp mind. In the early hours of the morning, the wind finally began to die down. Billy was resting, his pain eased. Annie sat by the small, sputtering fire, exhausted but awake. Colton sat across from her, cleaning a piece of tack. The other men were asleep. "You were right," he said, his voice quiet in the near darkness. "We needed you. Your father taught you well." "He was a good man," Annie replied, her voice soft. "He believed that healing was about more than just medicine. It was about listening." Colton fell silent, his hands stilling their work. He looked at his own scarred hand, the fingers twisted and stiff. "Some wounds can't be healed." He said the words heavy, with a lifetime of pain. "Perhaps not." Annie said, her gaze steady and compassionate. "But they don't have to be faced alone." Their eyes met across the flickering firelight. In that moment, the last of the artifice between them fell away. He was not the beast of Blackwood Ridge, and she was not the mail-order bride he had purchased. They were two people, a man and a woman, who had found an unexpected sanctuary in the heart of a storm. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw a vulnerability in his eye that took her breath away. It was a look of raw, unguarded longing. He did not touch her. He did not say another word. But as he turned back to his work, Annie knew that something fundamental had shifted. The crack in his armor had widened, and for the first time she had glimpsed the lonely, noble soul hiding within. The shared ordeal in the blizzard irrevocably altered the atmosphere at the Blackwood Dominion. The rigid separation between the east and west wings began to dissolve. Colton no longer took all his meals in his study. He began hesitantly at first to join Annie in the grand dining room. The meals were often swollen, the space between them at the long table, still vast. But his presence was a revolution. The staff, led by a subtly smiling Martha, began to treat the house less like a mausoleum and more like a home. Annie's courage, bolstered by the respect she'd earned from Colton, and the ranch hands grew bolder. She was no longer just investigating his past for curiosity's sake. She was fighting for their future. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that Beau Sinclair was the true author of their misery, and she would not rest until she could prove it. Her staunchest ally was Finn. The quiet foreman, fiercely loyal to Colton, had seen Annie's strength first-hand during the storm. He trusted her. One afternoon, she approached him in the stables. "Finn," she began. "Martha told me about the foreman who was here before you. A man named Henderson." Finn stopped polishing a saddle and looked at her, his expression cautious. "Don't know much. Heard he was a bad seed, left in a hurry after the fire." "Do you know where he went?" Annie pressed. Finn shrugged. "Rumor was he went north to the mining camps in the territories. A man can disappear easy up there." It was a long shot, but it was the only thread she had. "I need to find him, Finn. I believe he knows what really happened the night of the fire." Seeing the grim determination in her eyes, Finn made a decision. "The boss. Colton. He's a good man, Mrs. Blackwood. The best I've ever known. He don't deserve what's been done to him." He paused, then said, "I have a cousin who runs a freight line up to Helena. He hears things. I'll send a letter." While they waited for a reply, Annie turned her attention to the ranch's own records. In Colton's study, a room she now entered with his unspoken permission, she found meticulously kept ledgers dating back to his father's time. She spent days poring over the accounts from the year of the fire, comparing them to the ones from the year Sinclair acted as guardian. The discrepancy was glaring. During the year of his guardianship, Sinclair had sold off a significant number of prime cattle, claiming market downturns, but Annie cross-referenced the dates with the old newspapers. The market had been strong. He had systematically bled the ranch of its assets, funneling the money away. More damningly, she found a preliminary sale agreement drafted, but never signed for the northern pasture, the one with the crucial water rights. The buyer was a holding company, whose address she traced back to a law firm in Helena, known for its discreet and often shady dealings on behalf of wealthy clients. The price was insultingly low. Sinclair had been trying to sell the land to himself through a proxy. Colton's refusal to sign that paper had cost Sinclair a fortune. It was the motive she had been looking for. 2 weeks later, Finn's cousin sent a letter back. He had found him. Henderson, older and broken down by a hard life, was working a small, played-out gold claim near a camp called Last Chance Gulch. He was a drunk, haunted by his past. "It's too dangerous for you to go alone," Colton said, his voice flat when Annie told him. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. He had been quietly observing her investigation, his initial skepticism giving way to a grudging admiration. He knew what she was risking. "Then you'll have to come with me," she said simply. And so they journeyed north, not as master and mistress, but as partners. The long days on the trail were filled with a comfortable silence. They rode side by side, and Annie learned the rhythms of the man next to her. She saw the way his one good eye constantly scanned the horizon, the way he could read the land like a map. One evening, camped under a canopy of brilliant stars, he finally spoke of the fire. "I remember the smell," he said, his voice a low, pained rasp, his gaze fixed on the crackling campfire. "Smoke and fear. I woke up and the whole room was orange. I tried to get to my sister's room, Lily, but the heat drove me back. The floor gave way." He instinctively touched the scarred side of his face. "I woke up weeks later. Sinclair was there smiling. He told me I was the only one left." Annie didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his arm, her touch conveying a depth of understanding that words could not. He flinched, but he did not pull away. They found Henderson living in a squalid shack, a man drowning in cheap whiskey and regret. When he saw Colton's scarred face, he recoiled, his eyes wide, with a terror that was more than a decade old. "Blackwood," he stammered, scrambling backwards. I didn't mean for it to happen. He said no one was supposed to get hurt." Colton's voice was like ice. "Who are you talking about?" "Henderson." Broken by guilt and fear, the story poured out of the old foreman. Beau Sinclair had paid him. Henderson was deep in gambling debt, and Sinclair had offered to clear it. All he had to do was start a small fire in the Blackwood barn. Sinclair wanted to spook Thomas Blackwood, to create a financial crisis that would force him to sell the northern pasture. It was meant to be a warning, a contained act of sabotage. "But the storm," Henderson sobbed. "The wind was so strong. It got out of control so fast. Sinclair was there, watching from the ridge. When he saw it spread to the house, he just rode away. He left them to burn. Then he came back later, playing the hero, pulling you from the flames. He saved you to be his pawn." The confession hung in the air, a poisonous cloud. Here was the truth, ugly and raw. The real monster wasn't the man with the burned face. It was the handsome, charming man who had orchestrated the entire tragedy and built his reputation on its ashes. Colton stood like a statue of granite, his expression unreadable, but Annie could see the tremor in his good hand. the validation of his deepest, darkest suspicions, was a terrible, bitter vindication. They brought Henderson back with them to Whispering Creek, a broken man, ready to confess his sins. Annie now had the motive from the ledgers and the witness to the crime. As they rode back towards the valley, she looked at Colton. A storm was gathering in his blue eye, a reckoning that had been brewing for 15 long years. Beau Sinclair had tried to unveil a monster, and he had succeeded. He just had the wrong man. Before Colton and Annie could present their evidence, Beau Sinclair struck first. In a desperate preemptive move, he petitioned the town council to have Colton declared mentally incompetent, a danger to himself and the community, with Annie painted as a manipulative gold digger. The hearing was called for the next day, and the town hall was packed with citizens eager to witness the final downfall of the beast of Blackwood Ridge. Beau presented his case with a charmer's sorrow, portraying Colton as a tragic madman, and himself as the concerned neighbor, ready to take control of the estate for the good of all. When it was Colton's turn, he and Annie walked to the front, flanked by Finn and a trembling Henderson. Colton wore no hat, his scarred face a stark accusation under the room's harsh lights. For 15 years, Colton's voice rumbled, silencing the room. You have looked at this face and seen a monster. You've whispered and feared my shadow. All that time, the real monster has smiled at you, shaken your hands, and lived among you. He turned his piercing eye on Beau. This man didn't save me from a fire. He started it. A gasp swept the crowd as Beau leaped up, shouting, "Lies, the ravings of a lunatic!" Annie stepped forward with the ranch ledgers. In a clear, steady voice, she laid out the financial motive, the stolen profits, the attempt to seize the land, the cold, hard numbers of Sinclair's greed. Then they called Henderson. The old foreman, broken by guilt, pointed a shaking finger at Beau. He paid me to set a small fire in the barn, just to scare Blackwood's father into selling. But the wind, it spread to the house. Sobs racked his body. He was there, watching from the ridge. He watched them burn and did nothing. The confession detonated in the silent room. The townspeople stared at Beau Sinclair, his handsome face now a mask of pure panic. They looked at Colton's scars and finally saw not a monster's mark, but a survivor's map of pain. The town's 15 years of prejudice crumbled in an instant. Seeing the tide turn, the sheriff slammed his gavel. Beauregard Sinclair, you are under arrest. In the quiet spring that followed Sinclair's conviction, the Blackwood Dominion was transformed. One evening, Annie was in her garden now, a riot of color and life, when Colton came to stand beside her. The setting sun softened the harsh lines of his scars. You gave me back my name, Annie, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You saw a man, when everyone else saw a monster. I saw a soul, she replied softly, turning to him. A beautiful one. He reached out his unscarred hand, gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was a question full of hesitant wonder. She leaned into it, her eyes holding his. The vast, lonely space that had defined their marriage had vanished, replaced by a love forged in truth and sealed in courage. He lowered his head, and his lips, the twisted and the whole, met hers. It was a kiss not of passion, but of profound homecoming, a silent vow that healed the deepest wounds. The scars remained, but they were no longer a barrier. They were simply a part of the man she loved in a house that was finally a home. Colton and Annie's story teaches us that the deepest scars are often the ones we cannot see, and true beauty resides not in a flawless face, but in a courageous and compassionate soul. It's a reminder that love isn't about finding a perfect person, but about seeing an imperfect person perfectly. They rebuilt a life from the ashes of a terrible crime, proving that truth can silence gossip, and that love can bloom in the most barren of landscapes. Their journey shows us the power of looking beyond the surface and having the courage to embrace the heart within. If their story of resilience and redemption touched your heart, please help us share it by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story of true love against all odds, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales that uncover the hidden dramas of the Wild West. Thank you for listening.